Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Welcome everyone. So I suggest that we start on time because we have a limited amount of time, and I'm sure that my panelists will be very talkative today. So it's my pleasure to be with you and to moderate this session dedicated to what energy security, what energy and technological independence for Europe in the race towards zero emission. And I would like to introduce the panelists, starting with Carole. Carole Mathieu, you are the Policy Manager Europe and Climate for IFRI. IFRI is the French Institute for International Relations. So welcome and thank you. On my left, Klaus Bonhoff, Director General Policy Issues at the Federal German Ministry of Digital and Transport. Welcome, Klaus. Stefan Sarad, you're the Director of Energy Program at the Nuclear Energy and Low Carbon Technology Commission. Thank you. And Diego Pavia, you're the Director General of Énergies. Thank you to be with us. And on the line, we have René Schutte. René Schutte is the director of HyNorth. You will know everything about HyNorth by the end of the session, and is also the chair of the Clean Hydrogen Partnership Governing Board. René, I know you couldn't be with us physically today, but thank you for joining online.
My pleasure.
Okay. So before starting and jumping into the exchange with our panelists, a few elements to contextualize the situation regarding energy. You know that replacing 80% of Europe's primary energy will be required by 2050. It's a huge challenge, and this challenge needs to be met by the new energy industries to reach the net zero emissions objective. And there is no choice, so we need to get there. We've seen today the current Europe dependency on fossil fuels, and no need to say that with current situation in Ukraine, the situation is worsening rather than improving. So energy dependency is really at the core of the discussion. And today, the utility sector will probably become the cornerstone of a European energy system, and it's a major step towards energy independence, both in terms of flows and in terms of technologies as well. But there are many questions. Is Europe the right continent to produce renewable energy in quantities? That's a very good question. We'll need to address that one. We know that there are many technologies which are key for renewable energy, such as solar panels, for example, but many are imported into the European Union, while at the same time, rare materials, such as cobalt for batteries or iridium for electrolyzers, have a limited supply base. So the question is, what kind of energy and technological independence could Europe actually achieve in a net zero world? And that's the question that my distinguished panelists today will have to answer. So I would like to start with you, Carole. The current crisis reminds us vividly how important energy independence is. I just stated that. And today, most of the member states are caught between two options. They have at the same time to secure access to energy, but also at the same time to be less dependent and accelerate the energy transition. So my question to you, and there's not only one, but several, is it feasible? How can we address new technological challenges? How can we deal with the associated geopolitical aspects? And how to make sure that the different strategies will go in the same direction and will not oppose to each other?
Thank you, Valérie, for this long list of questions, and good afternoon, everyone. I I think we have to make it clear and really admit that us as Europeans, we are in a deadlock at the moment, and we have to acknowledge that we actually have no choice. It's not a question of whether it's feasible or not. We have to get there. We have to get rid of our dependency on imported fossil fuels. Because it's clearly not sustainable from a climate perspective, and it's obvious, but it's also not sustainable from a strategic perspective, because today our hands are completely tied in the conflict in Ukraine, and that is because Russian deliveries to Europe are covering no less than 20% of our primary energy consumption. So it means that it's a huge vulnerability, and it has always been, but today it's suddenly very clear. And I think it's not sustainable either from an economic perspective, because, for example, today I think the EU is spending no less than 10% of its GDP on energy payments. If you take the US case, it's less than 5%. So today our energy bills, our imported energy bills are just hurting purchasing power. You have many industries cutting down production, so it's completely at odds with the re-industrialization dreams that we have. And it's also an increasing burden on the state budgets, because all member states are currently trying to mitigate the impact on final customers, and it means taking mitigation measures that are very costly. In the case of France, it's already 30 billion euros for just the beginning of this year. So on all fronts, it's very clear that we have to break away from the dependency on imported fossil fuels. The problem, I think, is that in the short term, it's also very clear that we have limited options. Of course, the first one is to save energy wherever possible, but we know that there are some limitations and acceptability issues, perhaps. The second option is trying to find alternatives, so alternative gas in the form of US LNG or alternative energy sources, and that could be turning back to coal in the power sector. So what you realize is that most of the short-term options are not really climate friendly. So that's one point about the short term. We have very limited options. But if we look further, if we think about structural change, then there's a case to be made about investing massively in a much wider range of options, low carbon options this time. And if we do so, if us as Europeans, we massively invest today, then we will see the improvements, major improvements in terms of energy resilience, but not next year, perhaps over the longer term, but still before 2030. So I think our challenge is to combine the short-term policy responses, which may not always be very climate-friendly, with a more long-term response, which has to be climate-oriented. And finally, if I can make one other point, I think it's also important when we think long-term that we don't make the same mistakes as we made in the past. What I want to say is that all energy options, all low-carbon solutions, they will have their own drawbacks. We have to make it clear there will be some new forms of dependencies, some new forms of geopolitical challenges. But yeah, we can manage these new types of risks. It's just a question of making energy security a permanent concern, and not just a concern when we have a supply crisis, because it's usually too late.
Okay, thank you, Carol. For the other panelists, do not hesitate whenever you have a comment or a strong disagreement with what is being expressed to just jump into the conversation. I will manage the timing, do not worry too much about that. Moving to Klaus now. So Klaus, we see with Carol that putting risk under control is key. And Germany decided some years ago to get out of nuclear. And I think that the last 3 nuclear plants will close very soon. You have 50% of your gas and 50% of your coal being imported. And you have on top a strategy which is really to focus on renewable energy. So my question to you will be, will the conflict in Ukraine, what will be the consequences on access to energy and prices, especially when it comes to mobility? Then, do you share the view of IFRI that both securing access to energy and, at the same time, accelerating to energy transition have to be conducted simultaneously? And I keep another question just for right after.
Valerie, thank you very much for the questions, and thanks also to the organizers for having me here and having me as a transport guy in the energy sector discussion. But obviously mobility is not thinkable without where does the energy for mobility come from, and you know, in the end it's the energy system as a whole where we have to look into the individual sectors, how to optimize the overall system in the end. So yes, you mentioned the very maybe specific German situation that we have decided to fade out of nuclear. We have a clear plan to fade out of coal as well. Obviously, besides what is always neglected or not stressed that much, that we have to increase energy efficiency, obviously, to reduce the overall energy demand as much as possible. We still have to find ways to utilize energy, and we need to look at the alternatives, and we already heard some word about that. In the end, near term, it's more natural gas, and we're still importing oil, and we have to diversify our portfolio, obviously, and Ukraine shows us that there is no time to lose in order to do so. But in the end, since we have also not only the European target to be carbon neutral by 2050, we have a national target in Germany to be carbon neutral by 2045. So accelerate the increase of the share of renewables is key in the energy sector as a whole, and in the transportation sector obviously as well. So just to give you a feeling of the German situation, around about 30% of the energy use that we have is in the power sector, and the remaining part is non-power applications, which in the end is basically oil and gas and coal. So 70% of our energy consumption is really, you know, depending on fossil fuels today. And if you look at the mobility sector more specifically, it's 95% of the energy we use that is fossil fuel based. And this is the challenge that we're facing vis-a-vis our targets on CO2 reduction and on being carbon zero by 45.
And how is BMVD supporting in order for the transport sector to address these challenges?
I'll come to that. One answer to your question is we have to do both. We have to accelerate finding the alternatives, and we have to accelerate the transformation process in the mobility sector that we see as a whole. So speaking about the mobility sector, we have a few very direct consequences out of the Ukraine war, the Russian aggression in Ukraine. We all see gasoline and diesel prices going up the roof. So we have a tax regime there that will help to reduce that. And we also support shifting towards more public transport if possible, so motivate people to go into more public transport usages. In the end, the challenges that we have are really to electrify the transportation, the drivetrain, and make sure that we get renewable power directly into the transportation sector, as well as renewable power via hydrogen into then the more molecule-based applications in transportation. So if we do learn one thing out of Ukraine, is that diversification is a good strategy. So batteries and fuel cells, direct power usage, and hydrogen and derivatives of hydrogen in the fuel market are key, and they all have their very specific challenges. Material supply is something we have to look into very carefully when we look at the scaling up of battery technology, of electrolyzer technology. In the end, as Ministry of Transport, one of our key roles obviously is to support building up the infrastructures. That's recharging infrastructure, but that's also hydrogen infrastructure, and we work closely with our colleagues from our Ministry of Economic Affairs to not only look at the question, how do we refuel hydrogen at a refueling station, but also where does the hydrogen come from. So this is obviously important to look at the full value chain. As government, you mainly have two instruments. You have a regulatory framework, and we're in the midst of the discussion in Europe around the Fit for 55 package, and we could go through all the dossiers, which are all energy related, but you identify in each of those why they are important for mobility as well. The second instrument that we have is funding. So we're funding vehicle purchases, we're funding infrastructure build-up. We especially passed a law last year in order to be able to finance recharging infrastructure, and we're thinking about a good way to also support hydrogen stations in a more effective way as we move forward. I think the question that we all need to answer is, in moving forward, how do we find, even beyond that, beyond the regulatory framework and beyond direct funding from government, how do we find instruments where we trigger private investment? And yes, as government, we need to look into the question how to minimize the risk in that investment. But it cannot be all about public taxpayers' money funding the risk.
Thank you. Very interesting to liaise transport issues with energy challenges. Now, I'm turning to you, Diego Pavia. And Diego, I'm not sure that everyone is very familiar with energy. So in a few sentences, could you explain what is energy to the audience?
Yeah, thank you, Valerie. So in energy, we're a strange animal. What we do is we identify innovative cases when they're very early, when they're just a dream, and we accelerate with the risk and we boost their cases. So some examples so we understand. Norvolt, I guess everybody in the room has heard about this. When they came to us, there were two people with a couple of slides. Today, 4 years on the road, it's a 12 billion euro company, 3,000 employees, and the first European gigafactory of batteries. The second example, Vercors, that is very close to here in Grenoble. So company built Vercors. So we recruited an entrepreneur, Benoit, and now they are up to 100 already, an offtake contract with Renault, again, faring well. Or talking about what is the topic of today, Core Power, we started in 2011, is a wave energy converter that today could solve around 300 gigas of 7,000 hours of rest supply in Europe. Today, we all talk about PV and wind, offshore and onshore. Well, wave power is 300 gigas that are just there in the coast. So we are already technologies there. So that's the kind of things that we do, and like those is 300, and we have already 5 unicorns.
Okay, thank you. We talk a little bit about energy independence, but when we prepared this panel, I know you mentioned your focus on being technological independent. You mentioned Norvolt, you mentioned Vercors, but how do you tackle with them this challenge of being technologically independent? And second question, you just mentioned the ramp-up, very fast ramp-up of this company, and you think that the gigafactories that everyone is talking about is the right answer to the strategy of doing both things at the same time?
So starting with the second question, gigafactories, if we want to win the game, and we do want, because we have to serve not only our energy transition, but also to get an export industry, is about scale. I mean, without scale, it will just be Mickey Mouse in the worldwide stage. So it's not a European challenge, it's a worldwide challenge. Without scale, be it in batteries, be it in PV, that we're reshoring PV, by the way, into Europe, in any of the new technologies, there's no match to the Asians, to the Americans. So scale is a must, also to attract the big infrastructure funds that, remember, all these requires a ton of money. And our financial institutions, both private and public, they have to green their portfolio, their assets under management. The numbers are staggering. It's 100 trillion between now and the end of the decade that has to become green. So we have to attract them with scale type of investments. Then on the first question of technology, hey, we have got technology, but we are extremely good at research, we're extremely good at creating technology, we're extremely bad at industrializing. Because we love the upstream, we hate the downstream. Well, we need to go from technology that we have. All the examples that are in our portfolio are all 100% European technology. What we are not good at in Europe is at industrializing at scale.
And another point that was raised during our exchange is that for you, it's much more a question of choosing the right technology than going after subsidies. And could you be a little bit more explicit about that? Because that might surprise many of the participants.
Yeah, So Karine loves me when I meet with her, the politician in France. Subsidies is a drug. What is the best thing for innovator is customer money. So customers willing to engage, even to pay a premium to adopt new technologies and new industrial ways. All the examples I just mentioned, none of them has got any penny of subsidies, any penny, but they have the order book filled. The green steel one that I just mentioned, the order book is, and steel, green steel is just a dream. Well, the order book is filled until 2027. Norvolt has got the order book filled until 2032. Let's start on the demand side. Let's start on convincing customers to offtake those new products based on European technology, and then money, private money will come. Subsidy is only a bit for the risking, nothing else, but not to start the case on subsidies.
Okay, message will be heard. I'm turning to you now, Stéphane Sarad. It seems that there is still a bad habit, I will say, that when we think energies, we think in silo, whereas an efficient strategy will be to address them at the same time, implement an holistic approach, and combine these different energy in an appropriate ways. But how do you conceive a balance in the triangle between nuclear, wind, and solar? You have both, I mean, energy, alternative energy, and nuclear energy in your commission. And France has an energy approach which is a little bit different from Germany, focusing a little bit more on nuclear. So in which way will it help accelerating this energy transition? And how, a very specific question, how this strategy is compatible with a renewable mix target from France in the electricity grid?
Thank you very much, Valérie. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for inviting me with those very, very, very important panelists. Yes, that's a very important question. And in fact, in our RTO, CEA, 2 years ago, we made a big move putting together scientists working on renewable energy and nuclear energy together. That seems simple. It was not that simple. And it seems that it's very important for us. It was very important for us to develop an integrated vision of the energy transition. Why? Because, in fact, if I may, I don't really have the same triangle in my head. In my triangle, if I take a little altitude, at the top, there is the production of low-carbon energy, low-carbon electricity. And therefore, we need either renewable and nuclear. Why? Because we need to increase renewable energy, because we can develop faster those systems. And that was presented by our president, Emmanuel Macron, because he made an announcement last February with the development of 100 gigawatt on solar energy within 2050. It means that we will multiply by 10 our structure. For wind turbine offshore, the idea is to achieve 40 gigawatt within 2050. It means 50 plants, and we are starting the first one this year. And for inland wind turbine, then we will have to double our capacity, reaching 38 gigawatt in 2050. So we have to increase, and that's the policy, to increase the part of renewable energy, because we can go faster in this direction. And those energies are renewable and intermittent. And therefore, we think that we need a base load in order to have the good balance. And the good balance for us and other countries in Europe made different choice. In France, we have the choice of nuclear energy that we have since the 70s. And then in my head, the first part is the production of low carbon electricity with an increasing part of renewable energy and a decreasing part of nuclear energy. And moreover, with a nuclear energy able to have a real-time adaptation of renewable energy. It means that you have sun, you have a lot of wind, and therefore we have to make possible to decrease as much as possible the nuclear power plant. And at the contrary, we have to work on switch on, switch off, and it means that we develop for nuclear energy new fuels able to ensure such conditions. So we have to find the good balance, and of course we will have an increasing part of renewable energy. That's the first angle of my triangle. My second angle is connected to flexibility and storage. Because we will have more and more renewable energy, and therefore we need solutions for storage, such as battery, and of course hydrogen. That should be a very interesting part for our policy for storage. And that's a good question. My neighbors put that on the table. Where will we will produce this hydrogen? We'll produce in Europe, in our countries, because if you want to produce low carbon hydrogen, then you need a large amount of low carbon electricity. And the cost of the hydrogen will be finally the cost of the electricity. Or this hydrogen will be produced in other countries where there is a lot of sun, but you will have to make transportation, and you have to take into account that in those countries where there is a lot of sun, sometimes there is not a lot of water. And then if we use water to create hydrogen for our rich countries, that should be a question. So my second part of the angle is storage. And the third one is, of course, the electricity transmission, is the smart grid. Why? Because in France, nowadays, the part of electricity in our total energy consumption is roughly 25%. In 2050, according to RTE, the part of electricity will be 55%. It means that a large part of the decarbonation of the industry, agriculture, houses, and of course mobility will be connected with the production of electricity. It means that we will have a lot of demand in terms of electricity. And therefore, we have to think now about the possible smart grid. And the smart grid starts for me with your actual or future electric vehicles, which is not an electric vehicle for me. It's a battery on wheels. And when this battery on wheels is connected to your house, to your building, that's the first level of the grid, in your town, in your region, in your country, in Europe, because we have an interconnection. And then we have to develop very, very, very smart grids able to answer the demands in electricity that we know that it will be, of course, increasing. That's my triangle. And in the middle, there is one thing, which is the raw materials, how to develop all this process, because we have the idea that for 2050, and that's an International Energy Agency who made that on the table, for 2050, 50% of the process we will need are not yet developed. So we have to increase the research on that, and then we will increase the mobility on raw materials, and that's another question.
But that's a question we'll address a little bit later. So now I'm turning to our at-distance panelist, René Schutte. René, Europe is taking the required measures to accelerate in terms of energy independence. There have been recent and numerous talks about Repower Europe, and we know that hydrogen will definitely play a key role. You are leading the High North initiative. So first, could you describe us a little bit this initiative? And then, do you think that High North is the answer as an alternative to fossil fuels? And how can it be duplicated elsewhere?
Okay, thank you, Valerie, and thank you all for having me in an online virtual version. I'm happy to explain something about what the initiative of High North is. And actually that is concerning building the full value chain for hydrogen. I think what we've already heard from the previous speakers is that we have a massive task ahead in terms of decarbonization, in terms of getting the percentages right. I've learned the electricity consumption just mentioned in France at this moment in time, 25%. Should increase to 55%. The same is happening for the Netherlands. We have about 20% of electricity use at this moment in time, and 80% is in form of molecules, either be oil or gas. So making molecules sustainable is, I would say, a larger task than making the electrons sustainable for the Netherlands, due to the volumes, but also because we need the clean molecules. What we've seen in Repower EU is that the Commission, who was already very ambitious about hydrogen, became even more ambitious in setting the targets for 2030. We're now talking about, let's say, 320 gigawatts of hydrogen capacity that is required by then globally, only to feed Europe with sustainable molecules by 2030. And let's keep in mind at this moment in time, we have about a global production capacity of electrolyzers of 3 gigawatts per year. So just to put in perspective what tasks are lying ahead in expanding production plants, in expanding, let's say, the production, but also the need for materials and getting all the materials in time, but on the expansion for renewable energy, for solar, wind, maybe even nuclear. So a massive task ahead. Discussion we've had in the past is all about scaling up, and the plans become larger and larger. What actually High North is doing is looking at how to start this value chain. What we want to do is we want to build a hydrogen valley in the Netherlands, but you cannot build multiple gigawatts hydrogen valley at once. You need to take your small steps. So what High North is doing is actually trying to combine all the different projects from all the different parties in the value chain, making sure that everybody understands the dependencies between the projects, and that is going from the renewable energy source until the end use. And I also heard the stimulation for the end use being promoted, which I very much welcome, because I think that actually will help in developing the supply chain. But then the role of High North is trying to synchronize all the different decision making that needs to be done to start at the same time, from renewable energy source, from production to transport to storage to end use, in combination with government, in combination with policy institutions. You cannot start at gigawatt scale, you should start at smaller scale, and we're trying to help doing that, identify dependencies, identify the issues, and help solving them, so we can not build the gigawatts from starters, but we can build the multiple megawatts from starters and further build on that. And that's we want to do in a kind of hub and spoke model. So not having the large concentrations everywhere, but having to start with the smaller concentrations of demand and supply and build it from there. We can do it fast, but we need to take it step by step. Okay. So that's actually what we're trying to do. And yes, for sure, this model can be used in other areas. We can learn also from other areas where similar developments are taking place. And I think trying to reach the climate goals is in the end about cooperation, not only within the value chain, but also on a geographical basis.
Thank you, René. So moving now from Netherlands back to Germany, so we see that Germany is really getting prepared to address decarbonation of our world with clear targets through these new technologies. But focus seems to be more on decarbonating industry. And we all know that transport and mobility are key for the economic growth. So within BMVD, how do you make sure that transport remains at the core when the focus is much more on decarbonating the industry? And how do you liaise both? I know it's a tricky question, Klaus, but thanks for answering it.
Well, I at least try to give it a shot. I mean, we're all aware of the fact that mobility is key for an industrialized country. Whether it's our individual mobility, whether it's mobility of goods. So we all know that we have to make sure that mobility keeps being available, but it needs to be zero emission in the end of the day. And you're right that in the political discussion sometimes, in a black and white discussion, the argument is, well, mobility is not that difficult. let's just electrify everything and we're fine. But decarbonizing our chemical industry, our steel industry, our other industrial sectors, that's really challenging. So how do we do that? And wow, batteries will not do the job there. So okay, here we need hydrogen, and then where does that hydrogen come from? And that's a little bit the discussion we're having. So yes, we do. I even want to say constantly argue, if not to say fight, over the question on how diversified does each sector need to be. And be reminded that with our climate protection law that we have, each sector has its CO2 reduction target. So it's my responsibility as Ministry of Transport to make sure that we reach our CO2 reduction targets in transport. And let me be very clear, batteries alone will not do the job. They can do a lot of good things, but alone they will not do the job for the whole portfolio of mobility that we do have. And then you get to the interesting questions on how do you find system optimizations in between the sectors? And then all of a sudden you realize you're facing the same challenges. Everybody fighting for their sector, but we need to come to the point where we actually look at those synergies, whether that's the question on smart grids and extending the grids to make sure that we have fast recharging capabilities throughout the country, that we have capacity to run electrolyzers to produce hydrogen, whether on site or more centralized. Let me give you one example on an interesting initiative that was founded end of last year in Germany, H2 Global, which in the end is a trading platform. So we realize that producing hydrogen wherever on this globe based on renewable energies is more expensive than incumbent technologies, methane, steam reforming, whatever that may be. But still we want it. We want to buy this more expensive product, knowing that on the demand side, those prices will not be paid. So H2 Global is tendering green hydrogen from global sources. And yes, we're talking about national production, European production, and global production. I think all that has to be seen also in a system. And then this green hydrogen, and that can be direct hydrogen, it can be ammonia, it can be methanol, so any derivative, is offered to the demand side, and then you'll find there is a funding gap. And that funding gap is closed in the initial phase by the government. That's our colleagues from the Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Protection, as they are called now within the new government. Now, we as mobility now argue, well, in that platform H2 Mobility, it's fine to look for ammonia for the chemical industry, it's fine to look for hydrogen for the steel sector, but we need to make sure we also get hydrogen for our heavy-duty trucks, for our synthetic fuel production sites. So this is, the discussion we're currently having also within the government. But there's one important factor that mobility brings into this whole picture. That is that the mobility sector is willing to pay more for the green molecules. So we believe there is a reason why the mobility sector can be a good starting point for the scale-up that we all need. So it's not a fight about rare green molecules. It's the joint challenge to make sure that we scale up as fast as possible.
Thank you. Diego, we need to change the way we think energy, apparently, like you successfully did within Energy with technology. So what would be your recommendation to do so?
Thanks for the question. Two compliments to the previous speakers, and then I go answer your question. The mobility and hydrogen, today already the German car manufacturers, they are willing to pay 200 euros extra for the ton of steel to build their cars if the steel is green. So before we get to moving the car, they're willing to pay 200 euros more than they're paying today just to have a green car as far as steel is concerned. And steel is the second contributor to the CO2 footprint. So there are many angles. Let's not only look at mobility, mobility also has the car. And second, to answer your question, Carol said at the beginning something that maybe went unnoticed. She said, hey, 10% of the GDP of the European countries is for buying oil and gas. Let's put that more to a citizen, to my mother's language. Me as a Spaniard, I work every year until the 12th of March to pay the oil and gas imports. I work 72 days to pay the bill. The day we stop, out of 72 days, 60 days, because we're electrifying industry, transport, and so on, that is growth that is such a low-hanging fruit. 72 days of 365 days. We are just working to pay the bill. So the challenge is not but because it's nice to be green, is not because it's economic sense, completely sense. And then in terms of how to rethink the energy system, I fully join Stéphane on the storage. Today, 4 food for thought for the audience. Number 1, when we bring steel or fertilizers or cement into the electricity market, and we are decided as Europeans to bring them into the electricity market, those loads, they require 24/7 for being economically viable. 24/7, you can only get that by dispatchable technologies. We don't want gas, we don't want coal, so it's either nuclear or renewable plus storage. Otherwise, we cannot serve this goal, this ambition. One food for thought. Second one, Biden has put $1 trillion with a mission for all the American ecosystem. I want storage at 1% of today's cost. And you know the Americans, they will deliver. And if we are able to get a storage, whatever chemical, thermal, at 1% of today's cost, then the whole energy system has to be rethought completely. Third, today in some countries in Europe, when you charge your storage and you discharge, you pay twice. So regulation could also help big time there. And finally, today's storage, the jury is out whether our dear 27 member states will deem it's a merchant or a regulated asset. If it's regulated to be managed by, centralized by the RTOs, then it will become a security thing. If it's merchant, it will be a commercial thing. So we have 2 things in regulation that will untap what is, for me, and I join the Stefan there, one of the key foot of the transition is storage at scale, distributed.
Okay. So we talk about energy independence, we talk about technological independence. Stéphane, you mentioned a little while ago access to rare materials. And my question is first to Carole. How to secure access to rare materials? And could you share with us a little bit about your geopolitical expertise and insight?
Yeah, maybe first on this topic, I think perhaps it was a little bit neglected a few years ago. Now I think it's well identified. And one example of that is the recent IEA, so the International Energy Agency report from last year. And they only confirmed what we had in mind, and that's the fact that the energy transition, most low-carbon solutions are quite intensive in raw materials. So they will create huge needs, and actually these huge needs, they are going to add up to growing needs from emerging countries, and also growing needs linked to the digitalization trend. So we need to look at the raw material question also from a broader angle, and look at potential competition between sectors and between end use. So I think there's a growing perception that we have a potential issue relating to raw materials, and that it has to be taken into account in our low carbon strategies. That's one thing, but perhaps until now it was still very theoretical, with figures about how the projections would go until 2050, but maybe today it's already a reality. I'm not questioning the geological limits, but still there's a scarcity and market tightness on most commodities and most raw materials that are needed for low carbon solutions, renewables, but also EV batteries and so on. And it comes at the time when we want to increase our targets. So this morning we referred to the Repower EU plan. Now of course it's not adopted by EU leaders, but we know that we're going in this direction. So the most likely scenario is that we increase our targets. The one we had for 2030, maybe we will need to reach them by 2027 or earlier. So it's a call for massive investment in many solutions, renewables, electric mobility, hydrogen. I think all the options will be combined. And now the question that we have, and the question that all industries are facing, I think is it feasible? Do we have the industrial capacity? Can we get there? Can we really implement and have these projects operational within less than 8 years? That's the key question that we have today. So I think it means that once we have set the new targets, we need to think in terms of industrial policy. And this industrial policy, of course, it's about technology, and it's well identified in the case of EVs and batteries. So we need to keep going with the gigafactories. We need to reshore some segments, in particular relating to solar manufacturing. But when we do so, we also need to look upstream. And I think it becomes quite urgent, because maybe we'll have 20, 40 gigafactories, but we all know that the raw materials, they are the significant part of the costs, and if we cannot secure stable and affordable supplies, then we will never be cost competitive. So we can no longer neglect this upstream part, and we have to look at what the others are doing. And if you look at the Chinese, since 2010, they had this approach. They had this value chain approach, and they are the ones investing the most in extracting sectors overseas, and also they are the most important refining hub. So that's where we are, that's the situation today. Now, if you look at what the US are doing, very recently, President Biden invoked the Defense Production Act to ramp up mining activities and processing activities within the US territory. And he said, well, the executive order says it's explicitly to lower the dependence on China. So we are not there as Europeans. We want a more balanced approach, and our main goal should not be full independence, and we may have some limitations regarding mining on our own territory, but still, we need to act. I think all the potential levers are well identified. We need to assess our needs. We need to identify strategic projects. We need to think about de-risking investment, but again, we need to think about setting the proper arrangements along the value chain. So perhaps the HT Global platform could be an example, because if you think about batteries, of course, maybe some public finance will help, but clearly we need the OEMs committing with offtake agreements, and maybe then we will see more mining projects carried out by European operators, ideally. So that's a starting point, and then of course we have to make sure that we minimize our needs for primary resources. So it's about thinking about recycling, thinking about innovation. So I think there are many ideas on the table. The only question is, do we scale up our efforts now, or do we just wait until it becomes a burning issue and a limiting factor for our decarbonization ambitions?
I see that Klaus has a burning remark to make.
Well, just a couple of add-ons and specific examples to that, and I fully agree what Carol was saying, including the very last point on recycling, which really needs to be tackled early on to make sure that we have those logistic circles that we need. Two examples. One is on the question on scaling up electrolyzer technology. I think we do need to look as Europe into the question on material supply and come to a strategic plan to make sure that we don't do the same mistakes that we probably did on the battery electric side, on the battery supply side. And Carol was talking about how strong China was over the last decade even to secure mining capacity and so forth. The second example is on and on the electrolyzer side, just to give you that little figure, 10 gigawatt of electrolyzer capacity is what we target to have in Germany by 2030. So that's a massive growth of the existing market, but it will be only a smaller share of the expected global market. So here again, we need to look into where electrolyzers will be operated. On the battery electric vehicle side, battery electric vehicles will completely change the value chain of the automotive industry. And I'm saying that coming from Germany, where the automotive industry is one of the major industrial sectors that we have. I know it's important in France as well. We will buy hundreds of kilograms of raw materials from somewhere out of Europe. There's just no way around it. And that will completely change the industrial system, so we have to look into the question, and we're doing that very actively. What does that mean in terms of transformation of the industry, in terms of securing jobs in Germany and in Europe? At the same time, we need to look at where do those raw materials then come from, and how geopolitical stable is that. And in the end, it may not even be a question on is there enough lithium, cobalt, whatsoever available. It's about the mining capacity that has to scale up as well, which again needs some strategic thoughts.
And I'm sure, Diego, before moving to you, I would like to hand over to Stéphane, because I'm sure that as a prominent research center, you are working on ways in order to reduce the dependency on rare materials.
Yes, sorry, it's a big point. And of course, I agree with Carol and Klaus on this vision. And the idea is to have a global view. If I come back to the French electrical mix, we have to take into account the raw materials, first in nuclear activities, and first the available resources, well known in the world, give us more than 110 years in terms of available resource, not that long. And this morning we had a very, very interesting roundtable on circular economy. And then you mentioned battery, lithium, cobalt, nickel. We have roughly between 25 to 30 years in terms of available resources connected to our needs. So of course, it's a major issue. And how to answer that? Of course, the idea is to think about how to reopen mine in Europe, and we mentioned that previously. I've got two questions about that. Are we able to design new mine, taking into account a life cycle assessment high enough in order to be sure that we will have a public acceptance of those new mines in Europe? That's my first point. And my second point is, if you don't have an industry, mining industry, on our soil, for instance in France or south of Europe, do we have knowledge? Do we have enough knowledge to reopen in a short time those mines? And that's one of the major points. The second one is, of course, recycling. Recycling for nuclear industry, our idea, and that not in France, all over the world, is to move up before the end of the century to the 4th generation of reactor. Why? Because those reactors are able to use our nuclear waste in order to work in a closed loop. And therefore, in France, for instance, we should have, and that's written in the PPE, the energetical programmatic plan, that we have to go on that direction, and it allows us to have something about few thousand years of resources disponible on that. For the other lithium, cobalt, and nickel, the idea, of course, is to recycle. And you mentioned the fact that we need gigafactories in Europe for battery, for solar panels, but we also need gigafactories able to treat all those solar panels, all those batteries, in order to keep that in Europe, and then to feed this industry. And of course, in terms of research, we have to work on two possible ways. Of course, the efficiency of our systems. If we increase the efficiency of our energetical system, therefore, we will decrease the amount of raw material that we will use. That's one of the major points. And the other point for research is, are we able to develop substitute to those raw materials in order to develop that? And that one of the driving force of the research in the world on those topics.
I see that, Diego, you have a small question before I move to René.
The question is just to comfort the audience and also the panel. Recycling, talking about batteries. So last November, we already brought industrial scale recycle nickel, cobalt, and manganese into the cell manufacturing production line at the same cost as if it was extracted. So guys, we are 3 years ahead of the plan. So we have European technology at scale, industrial, in the money. Of course, the volumes are not there yet, but it's already existing. November is published, so I'm not saying anything that is not public. Number one. Number two, as an investor in, well, say 300 investments, we have got 7 investments in mines and processing in Europe, 7. And why? Because Europe, we can supply 100% of our lithium needs on the 1 terawatt hour annual production of batteries. I repeat, we can have 100% lithium, not cobalt. And you already also read that Stellantis, Renault, Mercedes, they already cut contracts with Vulcan, that is geothermal brine in Alsace. So it's not that far away, it's already existing. And the problem, as Stefan said, is the citizen acceptance. It's not about technology, we're just bringing technology from Australia and Canada, because they are the ones knowledgeable still, and also Finland and Sweden. It's about us, citizens, accepting there is a mine in our neighborhood. The rest is there.
I just want to react on one thing that was mentioned by Diego. We are dealing with renewable energy, battery, lithium, cobalt, and nickel. But we are very proud because in Europe, in Berlin, we have the new Tesla factory. And I want to share with you that in the top-level car, Tesla, in one car, you have 300 kilograms of copper. So we are dealing with rare materials, but other raw materials should be in a big stress if we increase so much those kind of solutions. So we have to take the global picture of that, and that's complicated and that's interesting.
Okay, so we're reaching the end of this very exciting discussion. And René, I mentioned that you also chair of a clean hydrogen partnership at European level. So could you tell us what is CHP?
Yes, of course, I can explain about that, and I would like to build on the previous discussion a little bit as well. The Clean Hydrogen Partnership is a public-private partnership between Hydrogen Europe and the Commission, the European Commission, on research and innovation for hydrogen. And we predominantly look at, let's say, the production side of hydrogen, whereas in the applications, we seek a lot of cooperation with other partnerships and organizations to help developing the solutions that we need for hydrogen. The Clean Hydrogen Partnership has just been established formally in December last year as a part of, let's say, the new 7-year program of the European Commission, where we have the availability of $1 billion funds to spend on hydrogen, and that $1 billion funds should be matched with at least $1 billion from private partners. So this whole program will lead to about $2 billion of investment at least for hydrogen in the coming 6 years. We do that on the basis of strategy, on the research strategy that we have, which is then broken down in a multi-annual working plan, again broken down in an annual working plan. And for the first period, we have just had the launch in March, which is actually a double call of about 300 million subsidy on projects to be matched by the same amount by the private partners in more than 41 projects over the full value chain of hydrogen. So it's a massive program, which is also a massive contribution and cooperation between public and private partners. And one of the topics actually in this whole program is recycling, circularity, where I would like to build on, because I believe it's very important that we not only recycle materials, but also start designing the products and the applications with circularity in mind. But we also need to take into account that the massive challenge we have in expanding and ramping up, scaling up, let's say, the solutions on hydrogen, will need much more materials than we are using today. So it's not only about recycling of what we have today, but also making sure that what we manufacture in the future is sustainable and can reach the targets actually that we have. So there's much more to that than that. And as part of the research plan, it's not only about recycling the materials itself, but also finding the alternatives for materials, which may be easier to find, easier to use, or otherwise. So it's something we need to do from starters, and not only at this moment in time looking back on what we already had. That goes for obviously for hydrogen applications like fuel cells and electrolyzers, but similarly that would also be applied for batteries.
And you mentioned also that regulation should enable innovation. So how do you make sure that this stays true within the Clean Hydrogen Partnership?
Yeah, that stays true from the moment that you do not over-regulate from starters. We need to keep in mind that we need to build a new market. And for the new market, nobody exactly knows how it will look like in the end. So that means it's this moment in time that we need to break down some existing rules. But as for regulation, what you need, and you need that from the start, is discussion on norms and standards, for instance, to make sure that what everybody develops is comparable and can be used throughout the whole system. So that type of regulation is required, the norm setting, standard setting, and cooperation on that. Regulation as to regulating the markets. I believe governments should be very careful about that, not to over-regulate in the beginning, but we need fit-for-purpose regulation to stimulate innovation and research rather than to block it because we choose the wrong legislation for that. I think an example of what doesn't help at this moment in time is the full discussion in RED 2 on the implementing acts, where we talk about the additionality, for instance, the empirical correlation for renewable power. Those rules do not help developing the scale of hydrogen that we need at this moment in time. Another thing that doesn't help to mention it here is also the discussion of PFAS, which is very ethical and which is serious discussion. But this material is used currently in electrolyzers. So if you want to scale it up and scale it up fast, we need to be careful not to exclude certain applications that make sense and may not, let's say, damage the environment at this moment in time.
Okay, thank you. We're at the end, so I have still many questions for you, but unfortunately we're running out of time. So I will ask you a last exercise, starting with you, René. Could you either, through a sentence or through a few words, synthesize the essence of your key messages?
Yeah, the essence of my key message is we need to cooperate. And we need to cooperate in synchronization. So let's find each other and make together the step and build it up from there.
Thank you. Diego?
3 words. Industrialize innovation. Storage. Let's accelerate. Let's push the pedal.
Carole?
First a sentence, I think it's not the end of the geopolitics of energy. They are just becoming more complex and we have to get ready for a more diverse set of risks. But we can manage such risks if we anticipate, if we measure them, then if we develop a strategic planning, and finally if we adopt a value chain approach.
Thank you. Stéphane?
Well, I will take the help of a very non-European lady, Margaret Thatcher. And she said, if you're not a part of the solution, obviously you should be a part of the problem. And I think that all the solutions on low carbon energy have to be taken account, and the other one should be problems.
Very interesting. Klaus, last word.
Wow. Intellectually, we all know what needs to happen. Just a reminder at the very end, be bold and hurry up.
Thank you. I think we might have time for 1 or 2 questions, so I don't know if there are questions in the audience. Okay, so we have grasped a few minutes to grab a coffee. Thank you very much, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you very much.